What I'm going to talk to you guys today about is a strength coach's guide to rehabilitation. And I'll go through the reasons why I think it's important, but I do think rehab for strength coaches is an extremely important area. Many a coach has been fired for poor rehab, and many a coach has made a real difference to where they work for their approach to rehab. If you've never heard of me, that's my name. My website is rugbystrengthcoach.com. You can reach me at keir@rugbystrengthcoach.com. And if you want to follow me on any of the social media platforms, you can just search Rugby Strength Coach and it will come up. I'm probably most active on Instagram, and I'd say Instagram is probably 50-50 split at the moment. Strength and conditioning and tormenting that guy over there. Me and Jay eating ice cream, Jay on his bike, all that kind of stuff. So Jay mentioned him before, Angry Bob. If you've ever picked up a copy of Muscle and Fitness, ever gone on Elite FTS, ever heard of 531, he's probably impacted your career as a coach. And in 2012, I ignored my parents and met a stranger via the internet and flew to New York, drove down to here with him, and I've kind of never looked back. So he's unfortunately not with us anymore, but wherever he is, thank you very much. To Jay, for extending the hand of friendship in 2012 and 2013, bringing me over here, supporting my career, and exposing me to people that have absolutely transformed my development as a coach. When I came here for the first time in 2012, I left feeling like a fraud. I went home, I tore up my master's dissertation and started again. I felt that bad about myself as a coach, but it absolutely pushed me to get better. And I think, obviously now I'm biased as well, but this conference brings by far the best speakers to any conference that I've been to. So I think you're in the right place. Also to Brinks, head strength with football here. He's kind of brought me into his team. He didn't have to do that. I've come from a head position, and no ego from him whatsoever. He listens to my ideas. So I'm not sure if he's here, but if he is, thank you very much. And to my colleagues like Tony and Casey at the back. To all those who've helped me along my coaching journey, I'm going to quote people that are going to speak to you later throughout this weekend. There are other people that I've learned from that are not here that again have had a massive impact on my career. So to thank you to those guys, and obviously to the athletes. They give me a lot of trust. I do some things outside of the box, especially in rugby, and for them to give me my trust means a lot, and to let me develop as a coach. So today is going to begin with a story about how I fucked up, basically. I was in Tokyo. That's my most recent post before here. In Tokyo, working in professional rugby, we had a guy that was rehabbing a moderate calf strain. He'd been with the physiotherapists, and the physio came to me and said, this right here, he's ready to go. And I said, okay. I said, do you want to hear the plan? He goes, yeah, tell me the plan. I said, right, well, what they're going to do is they're going to warm up, they're going to do some speed technique, and then the plan for today is to do 3 40-meter sprints at 100%. He goes, oh, he's ready to go. So we went out, we did the warm-up, we did the drills, grade 2 hamstring, another 6 to 8 weeks. So that sticks in my mind as one of the worst rehab situations in my professional career. And obviously, when you experience a failure like that, it forces things into perspective and forces you to learn from those mistakes. And like a coach once said to me, experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. And that's certainly an example of me not getting what I wanted. Here's an example of when it went right, though. So this big guy sat down on the Argentinian hand bike, tore his MCL on that date right there, 31st of July, 2015. He had the surgery that Friday. On the Monday, he was in a brace, sled dragging. About 4 to 5 weeks later, he was sprinting at full speed. It's a shit video because I didn't know I was going to give this presentation 3 years later, but you can see the speed that he's getting up to there. That's fairly fast for 300 pounds. Nice and strong there. And within 7 weeks, he played against the world champions at the World Cup. So I've learned from mistakes, and I can reflect on that, and I've also thought about times when maybe we did get some stuff right, and then look about, well, what probably contributed to that success? And hopefully you'll be able to guess the things that we did in this process right here as I go through the talk. So typically what happens when we have an injured athlete is that they're going to start out with the ATCs or the physical therapists, and there's going to be almost no involvement from the strength and conditioning coach. So the influence and competence at the left-hand side, so early rehab, is going to be almost exclusively PTs, and ATCs. And in this industry, there's no shortage of PTs and ATCs that are extremely good at treating acutely injured athletes. And then at the very other end, when their influence is basically zero and the strength coaches and sport coaches have complete control of the program, we have completely healthy athletes. And again, there's no shortage of strength coaches in the industry that are very, very good at training healthy athletes. But in my opinion, this right here is where high performance programs go to die, because there's maybe a lack of expertise or experience in how to handle that transition, or there's a lack of process in place to make sure that that transition is a smooth one. And as we'll see, it represents a massive drain on resources. And obviously, the more efficiently we can manage this transition, the faster we're going to get them back and the lower rates of re-injury, hopefully, that we're going to have. And effective rehabilitation, to me, is bridging that gap. So, why are we going to try and improve rehabilitation? The answers should be obvious, but we're going to just go through them real quick. So 2 years ago in the English Premier League, soccer, it's probably just as much in the American sports, there was £177 million, so probably the best part of $250 million in wages spent on athletes that were sat on their bum, basically. Not available for selection, not able to get on the pitch and actually do the job that they're paid to do. If you're in the pros, that's obvious. Even if you're in a college environment, the school has to pay for those premiums. They have to pay for the staff that are going to try and get those athletes back on the field. And if we can minimize rates of injury and rates of re-injury, we're going to have less drain on financial and human resources within the institution. In season, availability is the best ability. If you have your grade A players, and every club does because they can't all be superstars, you want those grade A players on the field, on the court, for every single minute possible so that they can have the biggest impact possible on the field. I worked briefly at Sydney Roosters, where I met my friend Graham at the back for about 6 months. I won't go too much into it because it was only 6 months, but basically the year that they won the Premiership, 23 players used total in a matchday squad of 17 the entire year. There is evidence, I believe, in the NBA, certainly in Premiership soccer, there's a good relationship between games lost to injury and success on the field. So the more that we can keep them on the field, hopefully, the better we're going to equip ourselves with a chance for on-field success. We know from Tim Gabbett's research into rugby league, when we maximize player availability during pre-season, we are going to see less rates of re-injury or injury in season. We maximize the chance to expose athletes to an effective training stimulus and make them robust to the demands that they're going to face in the season. I think not only that, but we have a duty of care to the athlete. We should be trying to do everything that we can to look after the athletes that place their trust in us. My default whenever an athlete gets hurt is to assume that I did something wrong and try and find the solution, rather than what I think some coaches are guilty of, which is just to shrug their shoulders and say, well, injuries happen. If that was my kid or my friend as an athlete in that situation, I would want to know that the coach is doing everything that they can to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I'd say the last reason is basically selfish career longevity. There are plenty of coaches that get fired due to high injury rates or re-injury rates, poor rehab. So just to put money in our own pockets and get job security, I think this is quite a key area. Before we go into the details of all this, I'm not claiming to be a medical professional. This is not a guide to medical rehabilitation. I would say what we're going to talk about is athletes that have a basic function. They've gone through that acute stage of injury, and now it's about how do we get them back onto the field of play. I'm going to defer all medical questions to the experts. If they disagree with me, probably they're right because they're actually trained in that stuff. This is more of a practical guide for strength coaches and how we can manage that transition. Definitely as well, run-of-the-mill injuries I'm going to talk about today. An example that sprung to mind yesterday, because he played for my hometown in England, there was a rugby player that hit somebody so hard in a tackle, he severed 5 nerves in his arm and now has paralysis. So I'm not talking about rehab when I talk about that. I'm talking about garden variety, ACL, hamstring, ankles, groins, all that kind of stuff. I think these principles are applicable to that, but when we get to the rare and exotic injuries, I'm not going to touch it. Certainly, I'm not claiming that all of this is right. There's a famous quote about marketing that half of the marketing budget is wasted. If only I knew which half. And I think a lot of that is correct when it comes to training. I'm sure there is stuff in here that I've got wrong, and If I have got it wrong, please tell me, and I'm here to learn just as much as everyone else is. So if we want to know the right way to do something, we just basically have to avoid failure. Half of success is avoiding failure. And we have to understand the reasons why athletes may get re-injured during rehabilitation. And my opinion is that athletes get re-injured for the reason they get injured in the first place. And that is basically when the environmental demands exceed the stress tolerance capacity of the athlete. Now, why would that happen? Well, maybe it's because we've done a poor job of managing the environment and they're excessive relative to the preparation of the athlete, or the stress tolerance capacity of the athlete. Maybe the demands of the environment aren't that great and we've just got a poorly prepared athlete. This could be acute or it could be chronic. It could be one sudden bout of stress in one big session. So for example, our guy in Japan, we bring him back, we do a very short speed workout, but clearly the mechanical forces associated with that session exceeded the stress tolerance capacity of his hamstring, and we had a grade 2 hamstring. Or it could be chronic. We just load somebody up again and again and again, progressive decline in function, accumulated fatigue, and then the injury occurs. But certainly there's an imbalance between those two that we need to look at. So either the model of rehabilitation sucks because we're doing a poor job of managing the environment or preparing the athlete to be robust to the demands of the environment, or the management of the process sucks. And certainly in Japan, they have a different definition of ready to go than we do in England. And that would be an example of our process sucked, and we actually needed to put in place not any fancy techniques or bring in new tech. We actually needed to look at our processes and how we shared information and worked as a team to make sure that athletes weren't falling into that gap that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to try and touch on all of these different things over the next 50 minutes or so. So what are the solutions to that problem? Well, one is we have to try and manage the environment. So not expose athletes to a stress load that exceeds their tolerance, either in an acute or in a chronic fashion. So what we're going to do is basically push the demands more or less to the edges of their capacity, to push them out of that homeostasis and elicit some kind of positive adaptation that we want. And then what's going to happen is the body's going to respond and adapt, and the capacity increases. And then we push them a bit more, and the capacity increases again and again and again. We pay attention to the stuff that matters, we monitor it, and we just repeat the process again and again. Communicate that information clearly between members of the team and collaborate so that we can get the athlete back on the field of play as quickly as possible, as healthily as possible. And some of you may be thinking, well, this sounds a lot like training. Whilst this diagram goes out again. And yes, it's exactly like training. To me, rehab training is exactly like training, but the base is just lower to begin with. And the price of error is higher. So as with all training, we have a desired end state, and we'll talk about what that's going to be, but typically it's going to be biodynamics, biomotor abilities, and bioenergetics. We have the desired end state of the athlete, so looking at the demands of the sport or the position, and we're going to work our way backwards to the current state of the athlete. We're going to assess where they're at, identify discrepancies between the two, and then try and address those discrepancies in a scaled, progressive manner so that we can move them from here to here. So the same rules apply to rehabilitation that they do as normal training. It's just that, like I said, the base is lower, and if you mess up, you're going to pay a much higher price than you do with a healthy athlete. So I think that we really have to pay attention to certain key pieces of information more so than we do with healthy athletes. And if we can do that, hopefully the rehabilitation process will be as smooth and effective as possible. So before we get to concrete examples of here's how we do the work and here's how the process gets managed, I think what we have to do is, when an injury happens, is really look at why it happens. I think, yes, it's true, luck is a factor in some injuries. Certainly you can do everything right and athletes can still get hurt, but then I also think 9 times out of 10, probably higher, there's always going to be a reason why an athlete got hurt. And Jay mentioned in 2013, he and I got in the car and drove from here to Minnesota in a day and a half. And one of the places that we stopped off on the way was Westside Barbell to see this lunatic dwarf on the screen. And, whilst he was throwing the numbers at us about who two-board presses this and speed squats this with all these chains, he mentioned this thing about training. He said, if I come to your house and I kick your ass, should you challenge me to a rematch straight away? And he said the answer is obviously no, because you need to find out the reason that you got your ass kicked. You need to go in the gym, you need to train it up, turn that weak link into a strong link, put the pieces back together, and then challenge me to a rematch. And obviously, when we have an athlete that gets injured, as coaches, as athletes, as an organization, we just got our asses kicked. And what we need to do is find out the reasons why to the best of our abilities so that we can train up that weak link in the chain and make sure it hopefully never happens again. So rather than adopt the mindset of an injury as bad luck or putting it on the athlete, it can be a lot of the time, but putting it on the athlete and say, oh, this is the athlete's fault. Let's look to ourselves and look to the organization and say, is this actually an opportunity to learn and develop so that we can stop it happening again? And I think, as with training, things are going to come into physical, tactical, technical, psychological, organizational, and non-exercise factors. And I think we need to look at all of these when an athlete does get injured so that we can hopefully try and identify a weak link in the chain or low-hanging fruit that we can improve to try and reduce the likelihood of that happening again in the future. So as with all things, I try not to have just my strength coach hat on. I try and look at all areas so that I can work with other people in the organization and hopefully have more influence as well. Because the truth is, if you only have your strength coach hat on, you can do your job to the best of your ability, and other people in the organization are just going to try and knowingly or unknowingly ruin it for you. So you need to have that influence across the entire organization to try and have the greatest impact possible. So what might that be if we look at those different areas? Well, it could be that we have a Nord board in the back. We're asking athletes to do maximal velocity sprinting that have extremely short fascicles in their hamstrings with extremely poor eccentric strength. And we know from the research that that's a risk factor and they're more likely to suffer a hamstring tear. It could be that we have got athletes that massively overstride in top speed. It could be that we have athletes that are robust in minute 1 of the game, using the example of rugby, minute 1, but when they get to minute 80, they get so fatigued and force production goes down that then they get a hamstring tear. So it could be basic conditioning. Ineffective tactical schemes. The Seahawks were famous a few years ago for trying to steal the rugby approach to tackling with their defense. So maybe one great way to rehabilitate athletes from concussion is to teach them not to try and take people down with their brain, like this, and rather lead with the shoulder, grab the legs, and then change their technique slightly. Movement literacy, especially with youth athletes, we could be asking youth athletes to move in certain ways or do certain tasks on the field of play that they just don't have the software to do yet. So if they haven't mastered that fundamental skill, trying to put that under stress, under high speed, high force, high fatigue is probably asking for trouble. So maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and actually make sure that they have those skills in the first place. Jeff is going to speak about perception of the environment. I think it's specific to vision tomorrow. But if you read up on the OODA loop, there's a section of this in Game Changer by Fergus Connolly. I'd say this concept I've really bought into in the last year. But the first phase of decision making is basically the ability to observe the environment, to gather information from the environment, which then you derive meaning from, synthesize and analyze, make a decision, and then execute that decision. So our model of the world, we build up from information derived via the senses. So if environmental perception is off, so for example, we have an athlete that has terrible eyesight or the wrong prescription, we are putting information in that's not giving them perhaps the truest model of the world, and they may be using that information incorrectly to put themselves in unsafe positions, for example, or the timing of what they do on the field is off. So it might not be sexy, but for example, we could look at, well, does this kid have correct eyesight? Do they have the right prescription? All that kind of stuff. It's just small details, just covering our bases. The relationship between anxiety, decision-making, and injury risk is fairly clear. I think there was a study recently, athletes returning to play with high anxiety, 5 times more likely to re-injure than athletes that had high confidence. Ability to concentrate on tasks. Once we've perceived the environment, the ability to derive meaningful information and select the appropriate response. Training load management. Tim Gabbett, very fashionable, certainly in Australia right now. I don't know how much people are aware of his work in the States, but we'll go into this. If you suddenly pile a ton of load onto an athlete, the body is not going to respond well. If you build it up gradually and sensibly, it's obvious they're going to respond better. And certainly, if you look at a lot of teams, when they arrive at the start of camp or the start of preseason, they go absolutely fucking mental, and then next week the injuries start to happen. And the same can happen with athletes that are getting too enthusiastic when they come back from a return to play situation. They get thrown back into the team, the load spikes, and then they re-injure. Again, nutrition, hydration, obvious. Non-exercise stress management. I learned the hard way with Argentina rugby that when they have a baby, you can expect an injury probably the next week if you don't modify the load. Just because the emotional stress of a baby arriving in the house, the lack of sleep, we're taking money out of the bank account and making the same withdrawals in the form of training, they're going to go broke and they're going to get injured. And I'm hopefully going to discover this in November with my green card baby. I met her in November. And then it could just be organizational factors. Maybe we had people in Tokyo that knew their area really, really well, but because of the language barrier, because of maybe a Japanese cultural lack of appetite to speak up and disagree, we weren't actually discussing how we're going to rehab this player and say, no, I think that's wrong, we need to do this, we need to do this. Not having clear landmarks in the rehabilitation process and say, right, your expertise is probably ending here, we need to do a transition. As I'll go into, I think when you change over, it's going to change based on who is in your organization and how good they are at what they do. He doesn't speak really good English, so I'll say in Tokyo, we figured out as soon as they can jog, they're not with you anymore. And thankfully, the injuries went down. It did cause a little bit of political upset, but coming in, we got the injuries down 30% in 6 months. I had a very, very bad year my first year, 5 hamstrings, and then the next year we got them down to 1. So I've kind of learned the hard way that sometimes that can be one of the reasons that rehab is failing. Having those systems in place. Are we collecting the correct information? Are we getting meaning from it? Are we processing it in a timely manner? Are we presenting it to the people that need that information to inform their process? And are we collaborating and making sure that everybody is reading from the same hymn sheet every single day? And I think if you are doing that in your organization, you're really equipping yourself with the best possible chance of success and maintaining a healthy team. So my background, I worked for Exos for about 3 years, and one phrase that I stole from Mark Verstegen is vital few objectives, or key performance indicators. Dan mentioned it at dinner last night. There's going to be a few things with every athlete that if you can make those numbers go up, the chances are you're doing a good job. And I think the same is true with every injury or with every situation that we've identified from this list. There's probably going to be a few things that we really need to pay attention to. And if we can manage those and make the numbers go up, hopefully the rehabilitation process is going to look after itself. So it could be muscle girths in an ACL rehab. It could be, it could be speed, strength, and power data. If we have a hamstring tear, we should probably pay attention to an athlete's fly 10 and make sure that he's back up to where he was pre-injury before we throw him back into a team rugby situation or a team football situation first. Because if we don't have those numbers, honestly, we're guessing. We can't always have complete information, but we should try and have the most complete information possible to inform our decision-making process. If we have an athlete that we think is out of shape, maybe we're going to have some kind of conditioning, energy system data available to make a call about whether they've earned the right to return to the field of play. Are we paying attention to spikes in training from day to day, week to week, month to month? How does the athlete feel? Athlete anxiety is a real thing, and it is valid information. It shouldn't be the only piece of information, but certainly I would like to know that my athletes are confident and feeling good, and they're ready to progress before I throw them in the deep end and say, good luck. Qualitative coach assessment. Coach's eye, absolutely a real thing. If you read guys like Nassim Taleb on decision making, relying on your intuition, alone is not a wise thing to do, because you can fall into the trap of emotional decision making, but certainly building up that database of experience and knowledge is absolutely going to provide you with meaningful, useful information in the rehab process. We can look at stuff like sleep tracking if you think that recovery is an issue. Likewise, psychological data. You can look at food and supplement diaries to make sure that athletes are adhering to a plan if you feel that is one of the areas that your program is increasing rates of re-injury. We can look at contextual drills and game data. This is something that I learned from a guy named Nick Broad, who used to work with Chelsea and Paris Saint-Germain. He's, again, unfortunately not with us, but he would look at accel, decel data off the left and off the right in a small-sided game. When an athlete's healthy, we know that he's going to hit this many high-intensity accel, decels in a, for example, 3-minute block. When he comes back to this situation, until you can hit these numbers, you're not going to go back to the team. That's one useful metric that you can use to assess whether the athlete is ready to return to play in the context of the game. And that's the most important thing, because if you can play the game, you're ready. Then on the right side, making sure that we have meetings in place. We in Japan went with the fairly Japanese model of you do your bit, I'll do my bit. In fact, the head coach once said that to me, which was annoying. But we decided with our return to play, guys, we were going to have a stand-up meeting, 10 minutes every single day, to make sure that we knew exactly what each player was going to do throughout the day, who was going to handle it, how we're going to modify it. And then we would also have a weekly meeting of making sure that they're flowing through that process as efficiently as possible. And if you don't have those meetings, you're not having those conversations, or the structure is not built to facilitate that, I think maybe the rehab process is going to suffer. Athlete monitoring. So for example, it could be doing the Nord board periodically. It could be force decks. We have force decks, or Jay has force decks with basketball here at the school. It could be, for example, groin injuries, adductor squeeze test. It could be just a visual single leg landing for an ACL, all that kind of stuff. And just developing standard operating procedures. So you'll see I have a matrix in place that I want every single return to play athlete to flow through, so that we can just tick off the items on the list and say, right, we're going to make an educated guess about, is this athlete ready to return to play? Certainly, if a standard operating procedure is good enough for a pilot flying a plane, it's good enough for me. And if you read Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, it's good enough for surgeons like him. It's a fantastic book, and it really convinced me on the use of checklists. So now we'll get to the training. First is going to be intensity, because in an acute situation, if I have an injury, that is because the intensity demands of the situation have exceeded the stress capacity of the athlete. So I've asked them to do something that's too intense. If it happens chronically, I've asked them to do something that they're not prepared to do again and again, so the volume load is too high. And then we'll talk about the collaboration and communication aspect of how we can make sure that the process is in place, that we're managing these two correctly. So, this guy right here, I work with him at London Wasps. His name is Tom Farrow. He's just taken over the head of England Rugby Sevens, who came second at Rio. He's currently in San Francisco for the Sevens World Cup. And we were fortunate enough to bring him over to Tokyo to consult with us on the grappling stuff. He's also a freestyle wrestler. And we were having a conversation about rehab. Excuse me. And he said that to me. Don't tell me what you can't do. Tell me what you can do. Just like if you have a kid that you want to be robust to a disease, you're going to give them an inoculation or a vaccination. You're giving them a weakened form of a disease to allow their body to be robust to the real form of the disease if and when it enters their body. I don't think anyone is going to be robust to the intensity demands of sport by being sat on their ass and not training. And that was certainly a feature of teams that I've been in where our rehab process was not good enough. The second there's any pain, the second there's any diminished function, they get pulled from all activity for that activity or that injury site. That's not the answer. We are not going to inoculate athletes to the stress demands of their position or their sport by doing no training. So we actually, rather than concentrate on what we can't do, we need to concentrate on what we can do so that we can make them robust and hopefully move them along that spectrum that I mentioned earlier and get them back to the field of play. That smart guy at the back of the room that's going to speak tomorrow, I think Abraham Lincoln said, "Don't believe all quotes that you read on the internet," but I believe that's a quote of Dan's. If you can't do plan A, you need to make plan B as close as possible. So if we do take the approach of, okay, well, this guy can't do any training, the whole time he's not training or she is not training, we are losing the physical, tactical, technical, and psychological preparation that made them somewhat robust in the first place. So my approach would be, or learning from Dan, my approach would be to do as much as possible, as hard as possible, as early as possible, to stop the rate at which we're losing that preparation, to stimulate regaining that adaptation, and hopefully making that athlete more robust to the demands of their sport in the future, and creating those performance reserves that are hopefully going to reduce the likelihood of an injury. This triangle I stole from Tom, or this pyramid, sorry, I stole from Tom. He worked with a sprint coach named Jonas Tauyadodu. If you watch the Shanghai Diamond League this year, one of his guys, Reese Prescott, won the 100. He runs a really, really good sprint group in London called Speedworks. And this is how he helped me to imagine the rehabilitation process. So if we imagine at the top of the pyramid is the highest intensity possible. So for all forms of training, there is going to be a maximum intensity in the form of force, speed, stretch, impact, so contact, variability, so the degree to which conditions of exercise change, and the psychological demands of the activity. And it may be that the sport isn't always at the maximum point, but we certainly want to increase those maximums so that we can reduce the intensity of the game relative to our maximal capacity. And this is what Charlie Francis would refer to as a performance reserve. So everyone's probably familiar with speed reserve or strength reserve. I think there are reserves for all forms of preparation. Now, if the maximal is not possible because of an injury, we are going to have to work backwards and increase the degree of modification that we make to the program. And all athletes are going to exist somewhere between absolute peak performance and laying in bed, can't move, completely injured. So what we have to do as coaches is to work our way backwards from these factors right here, find where the athlete is, try and stress them just outside of homeostasis to trigger that adaptation, and then hopefully come back and move them up, and move them up, and move them up, and move them up until we make an educated guess that they're ready to return to the field of play, and then hopefully they stay on the field of play. So if we imagine in the context of speed, the peak demands of speed in a field-based sport like American football, or probably not American football because the rest periods can be a little bit longer, but certainly in rugby, we are looking for repeated, what I would call applied sprints. To me, an applied sprint is a sprint in which there's some kind of change of direction, you're taking in perceptual information, you're having to make a decision, where basically the attention of the task is turned outward to the environment rather than just I'm running in a straight line, I can concentrate perfectly on my technique. If you ever want to see technique and field sport athletes go to shit, put them in a competition. You can get them in the warm-up, do these drills, it all looks lovely. The second you say the word competition, it does this, and the bad habits start to come in. So that's certainly an example, I think, of why that needs to be a progression beyond just closed environment sprinting. And then if you look at the time motion data of rugby, and I'll speak about that because I'm most confident about that, we're probably going to have a 3 to 4 second high intensity effort roughly every 30 seconds. The ball's going to be in play for about 30 to 40 seconds. It's going to be out of play for about the same. Graham will tell you the data on rugby league is probably more intense, but it's about that. So if we can do a high intensity sprint of about 3 to 4 seconds duration, roughly every minute, to me, I think we're robust to the demands in the context of speed to return a rugby athlete to the field of play. Now, if you can't do that, what about intermittent applied sprints? Can you do an applied sprint, so a sprint where you're getting up to top end speed, you're having to make a decision and change direction at some point in that movement, but I give you a full rest period? Can you do that? Okay, if you can't do that, can you do a closed environment sprint where I let you just concentrate on the task, you don't have to make any decisions, you don't have to change direction, can you just sprint at absolute top speed with full rest and good technique? If you can't do that, can you do a reduced load sprint? So maybe you can't sprint 100% of top speed. Maybe you can only go to 90%. If I can't run you on the flat, can you sprint with a sled? Can you sprint up a hill? You know, even if you can't do that, can you do a dynamic drill like a dribble or a prime time? And the advantage of those drills certainly is that we can almost treat them like a diagnostic tool. If there's certain drills that you can do and certain drills that you can't do, so for example, prime times, which is just straight, I think some people got a straight leg bound, that tends to be problematic for high hamstring strains. That can also give us clues about what we should be concentrating our efforts on in the rehab process. If you can't do it moving, can you do a static drill? Maybe it's just like a basic wall drill posture. Certainly you need to be able to maintain good positions statically before you can do them dynamically, before you can do them at high force and speed. So you can see how we're increasing the degree of modification to the program, the intensity drops. The reason I put an asterisk is once we start to get to drills and static drills, we're not really delivering the stimulus that we wanted for the speed session in the first place. So that's when I'd start to add in an off-feet stimulus to try and replicate that as much as possible if we can. So for example, typically in this situation, I'll put them on a bike, like a watt bike, replicate the time demands, the intensity demands, but it's off-feet. So we're trying to pair things up. So this is the matrix that I've developed for rugby. I'm trying to learn how to adapt it for American football at the moment. But basically, just taken this pyramid and turned it into a table. So if you, can you read that? Yeah, okay. As it rises up, you're gonna see more force, more speed, more stretch, more physical contact, more variability, and more psychological demands. And at each level, the athlete must complete the current level with full intensity, so full speed, full effort. Fluidity, because if it looks awkward and it looks like shit, the next level is not gonna look any better. They have to be confident because we don't want that anxiety, because we know what happens when athletes are anxious and they get pushed beyond where they're comfortable. There needs to be good efficiency to the task as well. Yes, we're going to consult the KPIs, and the KPIs that we pay attention to may change as we flow through a progression. So for example, if we have a hamstring injury, we may be looking at just basic range at this end. We may be looking at eccentric force here. Then we may start looking at stuff like fly 10s, and then maybe we look at, for example, speed decrement in a repeated sprint test. So what we pay attention to may change. Not only are we going to use quantitative landmarks to make a guess about the athlete, is the athlete ready to progress? We're going to use qualitative stuff like coach's eye, conversations with the athlete, meetings, all that kind of stuff. So I typically tend to break for rugby, and I would say American football as well, the training into different activities. I think these are the activities that are common amongst all programs. I would hope they're common amongst all programs. There's typically going to be some linear speed training. There's going to be some agility, which I think if you read research from Warren Young, listen to guys like Sean Mishka, agility is a psychoperceptual motor skill. That means that you're observing your environment, orientating yourself, so deriving meaning, making decisions and executing actions, and there's coupling between perception and action. So it's not just a closed, let's do a ladder drill, which are good for escaping burning buildings. Let's run to this cone, do this kind of stuff. It looks great, it gets you followers on Instagram, but it's not actually agility training, I don't think. There's going to be a combat element. Certainly in rugby, American football, I'm still trying to get my head around it just because the tackle situation, the blocking situation, I don't think is the same. Speaking to Tony the other day, lacrosse, what were the other sports, Tony? Yeah, hockey, wrestling, all that kind of stuff. I think it can be tricky to try and understand the demands of the contact demands of the sport and come up with drills that are actually going to train those in the context of the game. But certainly in rugby, I'm happy to talk about that, and I think we have had a good model in place in Japan. There's going to be some higher speed, explosive activities where there's short contact times and large degrees of muscular stretch. So to me, that's typically medicine ball throws, jumps, and plyometrics. Plyometrics being anything with a contact time less than about 250 milliseconds, and where there's a sudden stretch. Anything else to me is a jump. There's going to be ballistic power. Typically, to me, these are exercises which there's a degree of external load. Sometimes jumps kind of go into this, but a significant external load where the movement velocity is lower, and typically the load is trying to be projected because there's little or no inherent deceleration, which means that we're producing more force, not less. I don't use the Olympic lifts. Well, no, I'm going to put a caveat there. I sometimes use the Olympic lifts if athletes are comfortable doing them and they like doing them If they don't, I think there are easier ways to achieve the same adaptation, like jump squats, bench press throws, trap bar jumps, swings with a band, all that kind of stuff. But certainly there's a big element of what we do, which is ballistic power development. And then we have our basic strength, which is lower speed, higher force. So you can see we're basically training the full force velocity spectrum, all different planes of motion, all different amounts of force. I'll just whiz through this real quick. So for example, speed, we went through already. Can you hold the position statically? Can you get into positions and move out of them dynamically? Can you run not at full speed? Can you run at full speed? Can you run at full speed, make a decision, change direction? Can you do that again and again and again? If you can, pass go, collect $200. Agility. Static drills for agility, I think, yeah, most people, they can pretty much go straight to dynamic drills, but can you just do, I like the whole part, whole method of agility. So we'll introduce a movement pattern, break it down into the pieces, put them back together, and then try and do that at full speed. So for example, if we look at cutting, can you just do run to this cone, cut, come back? Does it look good? If you can, I'm going to put you in a game and put it under stress, take your attention away from that skill and see if it holds up. If you can do that, then I'm going to put you into what I call a general reactive drill. Those are drills where you must react to an opponent and start deriving information from the environment, but I'm not forcing you to make a decision. So it's a lot easier skill. I just look for your body movement rather than think, right, what's he going to do? Think about all the times that I've done this in practice. What was the best outcome? What was the best solution, and how am I going to execute it? That's a higher level problem solving than you're going to see in a typical mirror drill. So, and that's why I put what I call a low context drill after this. A low context drill is, let's say, a 1v1. When I do a 1v1, I only have to attend to the environmental information of one athlete. I only have to think about, well, what's he going to do? A high context drill might be something like a 3-on-2 in rugby. Now I have to pay attention to, what am I going to do? What's my teammate going to do? What are all those three guys going to do? And then the situation, the more stimuli that we have to attend to, the higher a cognitive load there is, the more intense a drill it is to me, psychologically speaking. Once we do that, I'm fairly happy to put athletes back into what I would call like an agility game. So it's typically going to be a practice or game variation where we are shaping the environment to elicit the kind of behaviors that we want to see. I like constraints-based motor control. So there's always going to be an interaction between the environment, the task, and the athlete that leads to a spontaneous motor behavior. I think they call it in science. And it's basically trying to creatively manipulate the task and the environment to get the athlete to do what you want them to do so that you can just ingrain those habits. Jeff calls it hard skill, soft skill. So ingraining those parts of the skill that never change from rep to rep so that the athlete is able to quickly access that motor pattern, and then putting them in an environment where they get to discover and learn how to adapt the skill in the conditions that change from rep to rep. Soft skill. Franz Bosch would call them attractors and fluctuators. Combat. Tom Farrow would say to me, how are you going to control somebody else's body if you can't control your body? And I think he's got a point. If you can't get your body into the kind of positions that you need to be effective in a combat situation, you've not earned the right to try and manipulate somebody else's body. And certainly the forces and the joint positions associated with basic body control and gymnastic movements are much less intense than we would see in a full-on contact situation, for example, under fatigue. So for that reason, it comes in first. Once we've done that, we're going to add in unpredictable forces and just basic combat games. So rather than control your own body now, maybe I'm going to ask you to carry a partner in an awkward position, or do some calisthenics with them as your resistance, because the nature of resistance in, for example, putting a partner on your back and squatting is a lot different to a barbell, and I think is going to be a lot closer to the demands of sport than a barbell on the back. Both serve a purpose, but I think we have to use both in rehabilitation. Combat games, I'd say it's basic stuff like pummeling to try and get double underhooks, wrist grabs, trying to tag your partner on the butt and get out the way. We're just starting to increase the force, increase the speed, put it under stress a little bit, just like we did with the, with the general reactive drills, or the races. Once we've done that, then we're going to go into low context drills. Now we're going to start to take, general combat drills, 1v1. We're just going to look at basic combat techniques. So for example, in rugby, we look at a double leg takedown, which is typically a tackle that's going to be low. We would look at a snap down, which is where you're high, the opponent's low. And we also look at a choke tackle where we're trying to get around an opponent, lift them off the floor and hold them up so that we get a turnover. In terms of offensive skills, we would look at basically how we're going to break down an opponent's posture, push them away, and basically create space. Again, like I said, I'm still learning to do it in football. But once we get to this, we're going to try and put that in the context of the sport. So now we're going to try and create drills. Let's say, for example, in rugby, when I get to here, I'm just going to, in a closed environment, expose my athletes to progressively more difficult task in a double leg takedown. So maybe my partner jogs into me and I'm on my knees like this. Find the contact, find the knee, change the angle, pull the legs in and they go down. Then I go to a half kneel. Then I go to standing. Then the opponent speeds up. Then the opponent can change direction. Once we've done that, we're ready to go to a 1v1 drill where I make the tackle, get up and try and steal the ball as quickly as possible. So we're starting to get closer to those demands of the sport. Once we do that, maybe I put them in something like a 3-on-2 or a 2v1, or we add different options for the attackers so that the person defending has to attend to more stimuli and make decisions. And then lastly, we're going to, again, shape the practice environment or the game environment to try and elicit the contact behaviors that we want to see and make sure that they're able to meet the demands of the sport of full intensity. Jumps, throws, plyometrics, balance and proprioception, multi-planar deceleration. I am more interested in, can you control your body in all three planes of motion on one leg and two before we worry about how high can you jump. If I give you a Ferrari and it's got no brakes, how fast are you going to drive? The answer is either very slow or very fast, but very, very briefly, because the result is not going to be pretty. Once we do that, we go extensive to intensive. Nobody here is going to be dumb enough to have an athlete arrive on day one, put the bar on their back, load it up to a 1RM and say squat. But too often, coaches are really, really keen to jump to what I consider to be very, very high intensity plyometrics. If you've never done plyometrics before, or you're returning to doing plyometrics, just busting out the hurdles and saying good luck is probably asking for trouble. So just like we would with a barbell, start with just the bar, cement the technique, build the work capacity, prepare the tissues. We're hopefully going to do that with plyometrics, and that's one thing that I've learned from Jay. So we're going to start very, very easy, build up the intensity until we can do that. And then we're going to go to intermittent efforts. So concentrating on very, very high outputs, but with full recovery. Then we start to increase the density, reduce the rest periods, and get into repeated efforts. And then I've added here variable conditions. Variable conditions, I'll show an example, is basically changing the environmental conditions, changing the feedback, changing the environment so that we're building a motor pattern that is robust to a changing environment. So we're working on that soft skill. In ballistic power, by its very nature, ballistic power is high force, high speed. So we don't have as many levels because you basically have to have the function of the other levels to be able to qualify to do power training. But I am interested in, can you manage your own body weight before I put external load on you? Because if you can't, it's probably not appropriate to put a bar on your back or to ask you to express even more force and speed. Once you've done that though, we're going to go into extensive again, into intensive. So maybe not maximal intent, maximal effort. We're just going to look to, again, prepare the tissues, earn the right to use intensive loading. Again, intermittent for recovery. Then we start to get into repeated high intensity efforts or repeated power training. Alex Natera, who was at Aspire in Qatar, exposed me to this. He's now at Greater Western Sydney Giants, AFL. He's done some really good studies on his PhD and repeat power training. High volume power training, he calls it. Check it out. And then in strength, basic function. So should we be, for example, attempting, let's say Nordics. I keep mentioning Nordics. I'm not actually a real massive fan, but let's just say everyone does Nordics for hamstrings. Should you be doing Nordics if you don't even have range or the ability to completely contract your hamstring yet? My answer to that is probably say no. We actually need to make sure that we have basic function before we expose athletes to high force tasks like a Nordic drop. Once you've done that, we're going to look at regaining muscle girth and addressing force asymmetries between the joints. We want to make sure that we're actually closing that gap. You see it all the time in athletes that, for example, tear an ACL, they start to favor one leg, they have that muscle wasting in the VMO, and we're just planting the seeds for re-injury down the road if we don't address those problems, in my opinion. Then we're going to look at developing maximal strength. Getting strong is like falling out of a boat and hitting water. You just basically add more load to the bar. There are lots of ways to do it, but that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're just trying to intensify the efforts and get the athlete back to where pretty much they used to be. I actually think that maximal strength is just as an indicator for return to play is a poor indicator. You will have athletes that will be able to chuck up massive weights in the gym. I feel really good, I feel confident, and then you put them out in the field and ask them to sprint or change direction quickly or take a sudden pulse of force in contact, and that's when the re-injury starts to appear. And that's because the demands of put this barbell on your back, squat down nice and slowly and come up slowly, it does not reflect the demands of sport. So I've tried to extend this a little bit further and start to reflect the demands of what I think a true sporting action is like. And that guy at the back in the white, Chris, he schooled me, I think was it last year, and basically said his opinion is maximal strength or concentric strength has very little to do with top end speed. He says it's all about isometrics. Some people say it's eccentric, but I think my opinion is evolving now. It's certainly not concentric, because the contact times available, for example, in sprinting are so short. You do not have time to relax, contact the floor, and think, oh fuck, now it's time to push. You have to pre-tension as much as possible and impact that floor with the greatest effective mass possible. That's a concept from Stuart McGill. Create that tension and then spring off the floor. So to me, it's eccentric and isometric that we need to concentrate on a lot more, certainly when we talk about sprinting and certainly in contact. Because if you've got someone running at you, do you want to wait for them to hit you and then think, oh, okay, now I need to turn on? Or do you want to be like a rock, the second they hit you, you're able to take them down? I would take the second option any day of the week. So then I look to take that maximal strength and start to express it in eccentric and isometric conditions. Then I start to put a time constraint on it and say, right, I want you to apply eccentric or isometric force, but now I want you to do it really, really quickly. Can you give me a pulse of force? Because if we think about the conditions of a lot of non-contact injuries on the field of play, typically it's going to be an inability of the athlete to produce large amounts of force quickly, often in precarious joint positions. So if we can get closer to that in the weight room, I'm much happier with the strength return to play that we're implementing. And then I would call it high velocity pulsing, the ability to switch quickly between contraction types and really start to express that force at maximal speed. And I'll give you examples of that. So here's an example. We have examples of speed, agility, jump strokes and plyometrics, ballistic power and strength. I've not included combat. One, because I didn't want to be the guy that injured a few of the freshmen coming in because I was filming my videos. Maybe some of us don't come from contact sports, but if you do want to talk about contact, I'm happy to talk about it. So we'll see examples of this. So this is just, let's say we've got an imaginary athlete injured their hamstring. One way that we might test the waters initially is say, all right, can you get into the postures associated with acceleration, for example? And hopefully the answer is yes, because if you have a hamstring tear and you can't do that, maybe it's time to call a priest. Can you move in and out of those positions? And obviously there are steps in between. There are many, many ways to build up to this, but can you do, for example, a wall drill? Can you do a prime time? More force, more speed, more stretch. If you can, once we get up to that, then we may introduce build-ups. So we may, okay, give me 40 meters or 40 yards, sorry, in America, 50%, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, and so on. My preference, or the mistake that I made in Japan, is an English 50% is not the same as a Japanese 50%. If you say to an English player, give me 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, they will probably give you that. A Japanese player will give you 50% up until 100, and then it's 100. So I learned the hard way, you have to control the distance because that way you're controlling the speed. If you just make it a race every single time, you're going to increase the speed as you increase the distance. That's the tip if you work with foreign athletes. So then we would build up to a fly 10. Can you do a fly 10? Brilliant. Now we're going to start to increase the density. Once you've done that, then we're going to start to add an applied movement. So this guy is a running back, but basically I created this fake situation where we have a DB and a receiver. So now he has to juke the DB and then get to top speed. And he eased off a little bit there, but I didn't want to shout at him because he was doing me a favor. But hopefully he would accelerate to top speed and give me at least a fly 10 through the end. And if Marlon did a better job of chasing him, maybe that might be the case. But you can see how we've taken that skill, we started to put under a little bit of stress, and we started to blend those movements together. The phrase game speed gets thrown around, and I think when we talk about game speed, that's really what we're talking about. It's the ability to get into sprinting and out of it quickly in the context of game movements. Then we go to agility. So we'll say, okay, well, what are the key points of a shuffle? I would say it's the ability to create the kind of shin angles that are going to create lateral displacement of the center of mass. Make sure you're in safe joint positions, not too much valgus, never too wide, never too narrow. This is a really poor position to move quickly or not get knocked over. So is this one. So if we can live somewhere in the middle and keep our feet underneath us, great. Build that up to top speed. I think bands are a great way as well to force the athlete to get into shin angles and deceleration, because if they have that band pulling them and they don't get in good positions, this is going to happen. Once we do that, we take them into an extensive to intensive progression. Start slow, get faster, 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 faster. Do you have any pain? No. Brilliant. Keep going until it's at 100%. Then we put them under stress and say, right, can you get into a good deceleration angle racing against your friends? We're using the cone there as a constraint of the task because they have to get into a good deceleration angle if they want to win. Put that cone over the line, cross over and come back. So we're putting that under more stress. It's at maximal speed, but they don't have to make a decision. Or they don't have to attend to environmental stimuli. When we put them in a basic mirror drill like this, they're having to pay attention to the movement of an opposition player, but there's no decision making required. They know what's going to happen, so it's cognitively not as difficult as, for example, a 1v1. Less speed than the example before, and that's why I put it into agility, but certainly there's no clear dividing line between agility and linear speed. There's going to be more characteristics of one or the other, so once you get to end stage RTP, you have to use your judgment about what counts as what. Once we do that, then we start to put them into higher context drills. Maybe here we would add, we would add a QB, maybe we would add a running back as well, so the DB has to attend to 3 players. And then we put certain constraints on the QB, so we're limiting the number of outcomes, and then we can start to loosen it up and put them into a game variation. For example, 7-on-7. Then we put them in half pads, and then we go full intensity. Jump strokes plyometrics. I think this kind of stuff probably gets done by physical therapists. It's mostly fluff, but at least it occupies the athlete whilst you're waiting for them to get into the kind of position where they can start to do the basic stuff that's not balancing on a pad. I have very poor balance. I apologize. Then we get into my broken ACL that's still hanging on by a thread. Now, if I can't do that, should I be doing the other stuff? Maybe not, if I'm a return to play athlete, but I do jiu-jitsu now, so I spend more time on my back than Jenna Jameson. Extensive hurdle bound. If I can't do this, should I be doing high hurdles? No. Then I go to the high stuff. Much more force, much more speed, shorter contact times. Now, if I take away the visual feedback of where I am in relation to the hurdle, and I change the surface, and I change the height, I've really changed those environmental conditions, and now I have to change what I'm doing from rep to rep much more quickly. And as you'll see from the video, it's a much harder task, because I nearly lose it at the end. Certainly harder, certainly more intense, and certainly much closer to the demands of sport, in my opinion, than your basic hurdle jump like this. Power. If I can't handle my own body weight, I don't think I've earned the right to use external load. I think it's real difficult to do ballistic power exercises for the posterior chain without external load, so that's why I put a squat jump in there. If you can come up with something else, I'm happy to learn. Extensive kettlebell swing. So I'm starting to put stretch and range into my hamstrings. I'm having to produce more force to decelerate that load and then re-accelerate on the way up. Then I might add a band, so I get an overspeed eccentric element to it. So now I'm really having to express maximal effort and intent into the load. Then I might get a partner to really increase the eccentric demands. And my advice is, when you ask for a volunteer, make sure he's not 320 pounds, because this happens. That was the blooper. Range, function. If I haven't got basic balance and I need to stabilize with a stick, or I need to work through that range, I've not earned the right to do anything else yet. But once I have, maybe I can start looking at unilateral variations to address force asymmetries left versus right. Once I've done that, then I can just go to my basic exercises like a 2-leg RDL to try and regain maximal strength and increase the amount of force that my hamstrings can express just in a general context. And once I do that, maybe I can start looking at isometrics because I paid attention to Chris when we did our podcast together. And we could do this at different joint positions. I could do it in a large stretch here, or I could go to what I call a Chinese plank, which is basically head at one end, feet at the other, maintain a straight body posture with your face up. And then you can get a partner to sit on you, can load them up with weights. We did this a bunch in Tokyo, or you can go to a back extension isometric. So basically end range. Then I might go to isometric pulsing. This is a tsunami bar that Brinks has brought in. I really, really like them because if you really drop quickly, you're going to have to put the brakes on very, very quickly and produce a large amount of eccentric force to decelerate that load. And it can be a little bit unpredictable once you start to mess with it. Again, another thing that I've stolen from Brinks is picking certain ranges and then really pulsing the load to try and target joint-specific adaptations, so angle-specific adaptations. That is certainly higher speed than what's come before, but it's not as high speed as this. And this is one that I stole from Henk Krijnhoff 5 years ago. So thank you to him. Very fast switching between eccentric and concentric. Big pulse of eccentric force as I come down into that band and have to quickly relax and turn it off, on and off very, very quickly. So to me, far closer to the demands of sport than a basic RDL. And I think that is where a lot of programs fall down, is because they hang their hat on the strength numbers and they think, right, job done. So that's the intensity portion. And I'll go a little bit faster because I'm running out of time. Long-term volume progression. Hands up if you've heard of Tim Gabbett, acute chronic. Okay, so Tim Gabbett now makes a lot of money, what I think stating the obvious. If you pile load into someone, they're going to break down. If you take your time and get there sensibly, they're going to be robust to the demands of the environment. And obviously, it never happens in sport, but if you go too slowly, maybe you're just wasting your time and you can get them back quicker. So high training loads are useful because it makes athletes robust to the demands of competition and training. How you get there is key though. And if you have an injured athlete, what you want to do is have the clearest understanding possible of the typical weekly demands that you're going to expose them to. And this is what Catapult would refer to as the fingerprint. All athletes are different in how they approach the demands of their sport, how they work within a game. And the numbers for one athlete may be very, very high compared to another. So we had a guy in Tokyo that was super, super fast. And on Catapult, he could cover about a game's worth of high-speed running, not high for him at all, in one tempo session. And we had another winger that was basically ready for the glue factory. He wouldn't accumulate that in a month. So just putting an average demand on it and saying, oh, well, good luck, let's hope it works, would have been way too low for the first guy and way too high for the second guy. So try and drill down as much as possible, not just team averages. If you have positional averages or individual averages, try and use those numbers to set your benchmark to return to play. Typical weekly demands, we are not trying to return athletes to play in a typical week, because what happens if the week they come back, they have an absolutely huge, intense game, tons of psychological stress. We put them on the bench initially, the starter gets injured, they have to come off the bench and play the full game, then we start them the next week. And then typically what can happen is athletes get injured 2, 3, say 4 weeks after they initially come back to play. And that's because we only prepared them for an average week and we chuck them back into a situation that's not average. So my preference is to figure out what the weekly demands are and then try and train 2 standard deviations above that. They may change depending on the situation that you find yourself in, but 2 standard deviations for us in Tokyo was enough to raise an eyebrow, but nothing insane. I think if you can do that and then taper back down so that the demands that they find themselves in game week is almost like a holiday for them, I think that's a good position to be in physically and psychologically, because then they're robust to the demands of what we're going to throw them into when they return to the field of play. Acute chronic. Acute is, what do we do this week? Chronic is, what's the average of what we've done for the last 4 weeks, including this week? If you operate within a ratio of 0.8 to 1.3, which is this sweet spot right here, the likelihood of an injury is lowest according to Tim Gabbett. This is consistent amongst all the Australian sports like rugby union, rugby league and cricket. My guess is that it would be consistent in the American sports as well, but I can't back it up. Once you start to get to 1.5, that is when the risk goes up. And certainly there's going to be situations where you really crank up the load to get an athlete back on the field of play. So for example, the guy that I mentioned in Argentina had his knee surgery, played a test match 7 weeks later. I can absolutely guarantee you we're probably like over here somewhere. But if you want the reward, sometimes you have to pay the risk. Just be aware that when you do expose athletes to that risk, injuries are probably going to, or re-injuries are probably going to occur more frequently. So wherever possible, try and operate within that sweet spot. Other research from Tim Gabbett suggests progressing somewhere around 10 to 15% a week. You can see here in the black, once the increase in weekly load goes up by more than 15% per week, the risk is going to go up. So if you can, try and hang around that number, but if you need to, obviously go up. Utilize an assortment of metrics. I mentioned 5 hamstring injuries in 1 year in Tokyo, worst year of my career. The mistake that I definitely made was trying to start too simple and get coaches to pay attention to training impulse and nothing else. And what happened was we didn't pay attention to the high-speed running, and then we had a big spike in high-speed running, even though according to the Trimps, everything was cool. And when we started to broaden our horizons and pay attention to multiple criteria, that's when we managed to bring the injuries down. If you listen to someone like Darren Burgess, who has worked for Liverpool, Port Adelaide Football Club, is currently head of performance for Arsenal, he would typically tell you that on GPS, when you look at volume, you're going to infer risk for things like shin splints, back pain, plantar fasciitis, all the usual injuries that respond to big spikes in load. If you look at high-speed running, you're probably going to look at hamstring risk. If you look at accel decels, it's probably going to, or player load as well, you're probably going to look at stuff like adductors, quads, calves, because it's those big pushes and changes of direction. So try and pay attention to a bunch of things. Just look at this in the slides, but this right here is the typical weekly demands in Tokyo. Trimps, volume, HSR, and accels. We have an average week, a high, and a very high. 1 standard deviation above is high, 2 is very high, and so on for low. What I've done here is Excel. We finish 0 weeks to RTP, pop them back into the team and cross our fingers as the typical weekly load, 100% of that. We take 2 weeks to taper and we work backwards from there. And then we calculate the acute chronic here. And this gives us a guideline of Trimps, volume, HSR, and accel for all of the weeks coming out. This is a 10-week progression. And you can see the acute chronic is a little bit lower. This is a 15, and this is a 20% weekly progression. I would consider 10 to be conservative, 15 to be average, and 20% to be aggressive. 1, because of the data that Gabbett talks about here, and 2, you can see we're very towards the upper end of the sweet spot for acute chronic in the 20% example. Again, there may be times where you have to go above that, but this is the guideline that I like to stick to. And I would say that the shorter the layoff is from the injury, the more aggressive you can afford to be. The greater the number of incidences of that injury, the less aggressive you can afford to be. If this is the 4th or 5th hamstring in the athlete's career, you're asking for trouble. So you have to be more conservative the more often that injury reappears. Patrick, I spoke to Patrick when I first got to Tokyo because I was having problems with acute chronic, because who wants to wait a month to know that they fucked up? Who wants to accumulate 4 weeks of data and then be like, we messed up? And that was the problem that I had. So I probably butchered it, but the conversation I had with Patrick was to look at 7-day rolling loads and then express the daily training load, hopefully above and below that rolling average. Because when we go more than a smallest worthwhile change above the 7-day average, that means that we've probably delivered an intense training stimulus. When we go below that line, we've probably delivered a low enough stimulus that's going to allow us to recover from the demands of high intensity training. If we have too many days that are consistently above that line, the chances are that we have high monotony and high strain in the training load, which we know is going to increase injury risk. If we have too many days below this line, we're never actually stimulating athletes enough to push them out of homeostasis, to get adaptation, to make them robust to the demands of the environment. So medium only works in clothing. Someone once said to me, keep the highs high and the highs low. Medium is where a lot of programs go to die. So now we get to the communication and collaboration. And Uncle Bob Alejo, he said this on the Skype chat that we had with Derek Hansen. He organized it about 2 weeks ago, and he basically said any high performance meeting that does not have the involvement of the head coach is a fool's errand. Certainly, when I've had rehabs that went the smoothest, lowest rates of re-injury, the head coach was involved in the decision-making process, and we would literally go up to him every day and say, right, here's the data that we've got, here's how he's feeling, here's how we would like to modify his load on the field today. Is that okay? Yes, okay. When he gets to this many reps, you pull him off the field and go do some extra stuff with him. Or, he's going to stay on the field for this. Is that okay? And the coach will say yes. In Japan, where the work model is slightly different, my second boss in Japan would talk to me through my assistant and then tell me, he would ask my opinion, what I thought we should do. I would give him my opinion and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And it was his idea all along. And it was a lot harder environment to work in. And I think the rates of injury and re-injury reflected that, unfortunately. So we have to work together as a team. Not only do we have to do that, we have to have a shared checklist for return to play and remove emotional decision making. We need to have some criteria-based landmarks from between the current state of the athlete and the desired endpoint, so we can say, okay, we estimate you to be about X% of the way through, or congratulations, you're progressing really, really well through this rehab. You've ticked off all these things. I've literally had a coach say to me, but he feels really good. Well, who cares? You cannot rely on that kind of information to make educated guesses about when athletes are ready to return to play. Clear criteria. Depending on who you're dealing with, the expertise of the people in the room, establish who's going to do what and when. So for example, in Japan, once they can jog, we would like control of them, please. And thankfully, the numbers reflected that in the second year. Centralized data. If, as a performance staff, medical, strength conditioning, ATCs, all that kind of stuff, if we agree that something is a KPI, it's a key performance indicator. If it's key, everyone should have access to it so that everyone can share the information about where the athlete is relative to the return to play date. Because the information that you're using to make your decisions, I should hopefully be using to make my decisions as well. And when we don't have that shared information, there's a major gap that athletes are falling into, in my opinion. Planning as well. We should be planning out daily, weekly, monthly with all of the relevant stakeholders. Typically, in early stage rehab, that's not going to involve the sport coaches at all because they're not involved in sport practice. But once we start to get to end stage rehab, absolutely it needs to involve the sport coaches and the head coach, because we are going to be putting them in and out of the practice as they can do things or can't do things that we have planned. A daily stand-up meeting, I think, is required to talk about what each player is going to do throughout the day. I'll show you the Kanban board that I stole from Mladen Jovanovic. Just 5 to 10 minutes. It literally just needs to be moving names on a board, writing down how you're going to modify it, and just having a broad plan of who's going to do what. And typically I'd recommend for all elements of the training, the lead strength coach is going to manage the healthy players with the help of an assistant plus interns. And then typically you're going to have one return to play coordinator that might be an assistant coach, plus maybe another intern if you're unfortunate enough to have large amounts of injured players. So in Tokyo, it was me plus 2 interns running the main team, and then my assistant plus an intern running the return to play. Weekly sit-down meeting, go into more detail. Where is he or she? Where does he or she need to be? How are we progressing? What mistakes we make this week? All that kind of stuff. The closer you are to return to play, the more this stuff counts, because the more risk you're exposing them to. And also, once you start to reintroduce rugby or sport practice, the load is suddenly going to spike. If you don't take away when you add, you just piled a ton of load onto an athlete that's under a lot of emotional stress because they're about to come back to competition. That's when programs can start to have a re-injury. And maximize player involvement wherever possible is my preference with sport practice. Athletes are highly motivated, they're enthusiastic, and they're happiest when they're training with their friends. So just labeling them an injured athlete and never allowing them to train is going to lead to an unenthusiastic, demoralized athlete. They're also not going to be very, very good when they come back because they've never, we had guys in Japan when I arrived. If they were long-term injured, they wouldn't touch a ball for 6 months, and then we wonder why they're shit when we put them back on the field. That's our fault as coaches for not trying to maximize their involvement in the stuff that they could do in sport practice. This is the Kanban board. I think it's a Japanese idea, but I stole it from Mladen. He has a great website, check him out. But basically, every single day in Japan, I don't know what this says, I think this is the same thing. But basically, we have full training. We have a name badge for every single player in the club. If they're in full training, they stay on the left, and to me, they can do whatever's planned for the day. If there's no training, for example, they are post-surgery, not in the club due to illness or a severe injury, we've just said, listen, take a week off and come back, that would be no training. And if they're modified, they can do some stuff, but not everything. We need to we need to discuss as a team how we're going to modify what they're going to do and who's going to handle it and how the day is going to shape up. And this is a very, very useful aid because it lays out for everyone exactly what should happen for the day. It's very, very cheap. Get a whiteboard and some name tags and put it in a place in your team or your club where everyone has to walk past so that nobody has any excuse for missing the information and making a poor decision. So let's imagine we're game day +3. In rugby, typically the most intense training day of the week. It's going to be a high day, a high training load day, and there's going to be tactically a defensive focus on what we're going to do. So this is probably the flow of what all athletes are going to do in the day physically, ignoring stuff like video, meetings, and all that kind of stuff. General movement warm-up, linear speed, 3 sets of 40 meters, full recovery periods. Closed skills, circuits, so it may be rehearsing the different skills that we're going to use in the applied drills and games down the line. Maybe some low context drill variations, non-contact. So it may be we're going to do some carries, we're going to do some partner calisthenics just to warm them up before we add in the high context drills in contact. So maybe we do 3v2s, double leg takedown to jackal trying to steal the ball, and then defenders can come in and try and knock us off. We might start slow, build up to full speed, full contact, so that by the time we finish this, we are ready to jump into full contact variations of the game at full speed. So we're training very, very high context, which is obviously what teams need to adequately prepare for competition. Then we would maybe have lunch, come in, and this is the flow of the weight room or the strength stuff. So we start with, typically highest speed down to highest force, and then we start to get into the extras at the end. So jumps, rows, plyometrics, ballistic power, strength, accessories, and if we had a lower body focus session, I'd typically pair them up on the highest days. We would probably have something like a single leg squat variation, a hinge, a knee flexion, and a torso. And then we'd finish up the day with 15 minutes. 99.999% of rugby players will choose to do chest and arms in this block. And 6 different countries, they all want to do chest and arms. Let's imagine we've got an athlete mid to end stage ACL. You recognize the matrix. Red means he or she can do it. Gray means it's a question mark. We're not sure that they can do it. So we say, right, okay, in linear speed, closed environment sprints, not a problem, but hasn't done applied sprints yet, intermittently with full rest. Agility has done general reactive drills, but we've not started to introduce decision-making or processing of specific information relative to the sport. In combat, we've done low context drills, but we've not chucked them into a more unpredictable environment where they have to attend to, for example, multiple opponents. Jumps, throws, and plyometrics, they've done intermittent efforts, but we've not done repeat high-intensity jumps, throws, and plyometrics. Ballistic power, they've done that, but we haven't done repeated efforts we haven't done repeated efforts. Strength, we've done eccentric isometric variations, and now we're into force pulsing. So if that's the plan for the day, tick means I can do it, but we might need to modify it just to achieve the goals that we have here in this matrix. Red means that I absolutely can't do it. So we would have that script for the day. We would go to the board, slide the names across and say, right, he can do this, 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 this. He can't do this. What are we going to do? So then we would discuss how the day, it's tough to read in blue, but general movement warm-up, no problem. 3 sets of 40 meters with full rest, not a problem, but we're going to add some applied movement. So we're going to add a decision or a change of direction just to get what we want from that session to progress them as quickly as possible through that matrix. Then the closed circuit skills, no problem because we've already done that. The low context drill variations, non-contact, again, no problem, we've done that. But when we get to the general combat drills, we're going to add some context to try and get them processing those environmental stimuli and making decisions now, rather than just responding. In the high context contact drills and in the high contact drills, they've not qualified to do contact games yet at full speed, but maybe we can put them into more stressful contact drills where we do a 2v1 or a 3v2, or we start to string all the movements together and put them under more stress. If they're not able to go through the game variations, maybe we can just match the stimulus in a non-game variation to try and get them kind of on the same page as their peers. All this is fine, but we want to go to a density focus. So maybe we're asking them to do repeated efforts. The ballistic power, maybe we're going to again do the same. So the ballistic power, again the same. Lower body primary strength variation, density, not density focus, force pulsing. So maybe we go into like a drop squat or a drop RDL. So drop, put the brakes on, return to the start position. So we're starting to get along that matrix where we want them to be. And then for the lower body accessories, maybe we go into the pulsing focus. So it would be examples like I showed with the RDLs. You can go into stuff like drop Bulgarians, all that kind of stuff. Leg curl variations, I've got some interesting ones on my Instagram, but that would be the general theme of the accessory work that we're trying to do. And then the last block, player's discretion, probably counts even more when they're injured, just psychologically. But if you did have stuff that you feel hasn't been touched in the day, that would be the place to put it, in my opinion. So I've massively overrun, I apologize. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, you can ask them now, or Jay, ask now or...
Go ahead.
No, I mean, if people have questions, answer them now or after?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Any questions? There's never going to be any. Drink? Yes.
I didn't see up in there, do you use all of this training to, as you said, people are good at the beginning of the game, they're tired and probably more likely to get injured at the end of the game. Do you use this training matrix to develop their endurance so that they aren't injured by the end of the game, or that they can maintain good form with running and cutting and stuff like that at the end of the game, or do you do anything specific for endurance for those athletes?
I think, it depends. I think what you do in conditioning varies according to the length of time that you have to prepare. But I think if it's a real weakness, yes. Otherwise, you can just put them into a regular conditioning program. And then to me, it's probably more important to concentrate on the motor patterns and how they execute those movements in the field of play rather than the conditioning. Like it's fairly rare to have athletes that are so woefully out of shape that that's the culprit rather than motor pattern, if you know what I mean. And obviously, improving efficiency and problem solving in those skills reduces energy costs anyway. Yeah, but I think that is one thing that guys certainly miss when they come back onto the field of play is the pacing and strategy. I put up on my Instagram that everyone thinks New Zealand are the fittest rugby team on earth. I disagree. They're certainly fit, but I think the real reason they look so fit is because they're tactically perfect and they never make mistakes. And I'm more interested in putting athletes in practices and game variations where they can relearn how to spend the energy they have rather than concentrate on the supply, because your ability to improve in that has far less limits on what you can do physiologically. But certainly if you've assessed this is a weakness, yeah, we're going to concentrate on it. Yep.
So within that matrix, so you get held up at a certain point.
Yep.
Like if the player's having a hard time getting past a certain progression, how do you attack that? Like, would you stay at a certain point for a longer amount of time? Would you try different progression?
It may just be like a sideways move and think, well, is there another way that we can kind of hang around this level? Because it's not like a clear definition of, all right, you're at this level, you're at this level. It may be, is there another way that we can attack it? Is there a different drill that we can do? See if they respond. Can we increase the frequency that we're training it? Stuff like that. But ultimately, if you can't do it, you've not earned the right to return to play. And some abilities are just, or some attributes are just super stubborn to get back. And unfortunately, that's the limiting factor. But certainly, I would try and concentrate more effort on bringing it up to speed, for sure. Yep.
What has been your greatest method to get a coach on board with what you want to do?
You catch more flies with sugar than you do with shit. So, I've said it publicly, so I don't mind saying it again. But when I arrived in Argentina, I'm a social media whore. I did not put anything on social media for the first 3 months with Argentina because I was ashamed of the quality of the work being done, which is not their fault. And looking back on it, they would agree with me now. But when you come in on day one, having a conversation, be like, oh, you're really shit at your job. How are we going to change this? You're not going to get them on board. So I think it's a difficult balancing act, because when you come in, for example, if you have a limited contract, you're there to produce results within that time frame. But often you have to wait and build a relationship first before you start to deliver the home truths and then say, right, what are we going to do about it? Because I think people are always more receptive to criticism when they believe that you know, like, and trust them, and vice versa. And that's actually one of the difficult things to do, because most of us in this room are probably type A personalities. We want to change now. It has to change. We have to do this. But ultimately, and again, Japan taught me the hard way, you are only going to move at the pace that your athletes and your head coach is comfortable with. But I think real good relationship, shared understanding of what's important, and then just regular revisiting of, are we actually moving in that right direction? I told Chris in the car today, I had a conversation with the head coach last year in Japan, and his feedback was, injuries down 30% in 6 months. The feedback was, the boys don't like the program, you need to change how you work. Clearly we have different values about what's important. I want this athlete to squat 405 pounds. I said, well, he used to squat that, but he's got faster since, and it's his job to be fast. I don't care, I want him strong. Should I worry about the details of the rehab program, or should I work on that relationship? I don't work there anymore, but yes.
So you know how athletes can be stubborn, and you talked about how they push through, or they can push through or fake how they feel.
Yep.
So running them through your general KPIs, do you find that using one as specific as the one you talked about with the 3-minute, as many XLD cells as they can get in a 3-minute short-sided game, do you feel like you need to go that specific with a KPI for an athlete that you know is good at hiding how they feel? Or do you think the general KPIs usually can weed out any doubt from the athlete?
I think certain numbers do not lie. Like if you would hope that a high-level athlete wants to get back on that field of play as soon as possible, and they are going to put the effort into a task that you give them or any assessment to demonstrate that they're ready to go back on the field of play. And if the numbers aren't there, the numbers aren't there. Or maybe the numbers are there, but they do this every time they change direction. It's like you can see it. And that's why I think you have to look at a variety of factors. If you're dealing with an athlete that is not in a rush to get back on the field of play, those athletes will get weeded out of the system anyway. And that's one of the peculiarities of Japanese rugby union. You get paid the same wage if you sit on your ass and never get picked than if you start and play every minute. So it's actually a convenient place for lazy players in Japan to just exist in the squad and not have to do their day job, because they're technically amateurs. Yeah, that's certainly a difficulty that we had. But I think, as with all things, I try and give the greatest amount of effort and time that I have into those athletes that are most receptive to it. So I just ignore those guys. Yep. Yep.
So underneath your matrix
Yep.
section for plyometrics and jumps, what would be an example of throws?
Throws.
Yes.
If we go back to this example, maybe because the thing I really like about medicine ball throws is it allows you to produce more rotational force. And if you look at injuries like ACLs, for example, it's typically going to be an inability to prevent this internal rotation amongst other movements. So maybe it would be, if we go back to the matrix, let's have a look. Multiplanar deceleration. Can I stand on one leg, throw a med ball to the wall, catch it and absorb the force without turning to shit? As an example. If I can do that in a variety of throws on one leg and two in all these different directions, then I've earned the right to go to extensive. Typically, I think we're going to be dealing with lower body injuries, definitely in rugby, most probably in American football. But for example, if we have an athlete that tears a bicep or tears a pec in rugby, we might be doing extensive med ball throws to the wall before we get them to do clap push-ups, for example. So that would be an example of sorry, I just shot you in the eye. That would be an example of an upper body progression using those same principles. But certainly your only limitation with that is your imagination and making sure that you can justify logically what you're doing to move the athlete along that process. Any others? Yes.
For your workload management, did you track that with exponential calculations?
No, and I need to get better at it. I was going to mention exponentially weighted averages. All acute chronic loads are not equal. I needed to get my head around it. And after I just did the job of trying to sell regular acute chronic to a bunch of Japanese people that weren't interested in the first place, I wasn't going to be like, oh, we need to flip the script. But certainly I need to get better at it. Yeah.